All right, let's look at number 10 from your worksheet. Now, this is y equals secant theta plus 1. Now, remember, the secant theta is going to be cosine theta plus 1 is what we're going to graph first, and then we're going to take our max and min points and make our parabolas from there. Now, looking at our amplitude, remember, is that number in front of cosine, which is 1. Going next to our period, which we're going to take the number in front of our theta here. Remember, we divide 2 pi by that number, which is 1 here, which just gives us 2 pi. Now, if we had parentheses, the parentheses would be around that 2 pi, and that plus 1 is out on the outside. So that's going to be our vertical shift. So our vertical shift is going to be up 1. So how are we going to graph this? Well, let's go over this graph. And the first thing I'm going to do is take my vertical shift. Now, we normally start here on the x-axis, but it says my vertical shift is 1, so I got to go up 1. It then tells me my amplitude is 1 from my midline, so I'll be up at 2 and down at 0. Now, one thing that I did today in class was I highlighted the top amplitude and the bottom amplitude just to see how high and low that graph is going to go a little bit more visually. Now, our period is going to be 2 pi, so we'll be at 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi for our 1 period. Now, it tells me that it's going to be the secant function, so I've got to graph the cosine function. Cosine starts at the top amplitude, midline, bottom amplitude, midline, and then to the top amplitude. So connecting my points, I'll get the cosine function. Now, remember that everywhere the cosine function hits the midline, so at these 2 points, at pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2, I will have a vertical asymptote. Now I take my max and min points from my cosine function to graph my parabolas. These parabolas are what make up the secant function. Now, taking my eraser, I erase away the cosine function. That leaves me with just the secant graph. And if you notice that the vertices of the parabolas will line up directly with our top amplitude and bottom amplitude points. All right, let's look at number 11 here. Now, number 11 says y equals secant, parentheses, theta minus 3 pi over 4, inner parentheses, minus 1. Now, here, I'm going to first graph y equals cosine theta minus 3 pi over 4 minus 1. Now, the negative 3 pi over 4 creates a phase shift. The number in front of theta is still going to work with my period, so I'll have 2 pi divided by 1, which my period is still going to be 2 pi. But my phase shift here, I take the opposite of negative 3 pi over 4, so that's positive 3 pi over 4, divided by the number in front of theta, which is 1, so the phase shift is 3 pi over 4. The number on the outside, that negative 1, negative 1 creates a vertical shift of negative 1. Now, my number in front of cosine is 1, so that tells you my amplitude is 1. Now, I'm going to fill in this table so that it's easier to figure out my 5 points. So I'm going to take my period, which is 2 pi. My starting point, I'm going to multiply that times 0. Second point, 1/4. Third point, 1/2. Fourth point, 3/4. And last point, 1. Now, I'm going to take those numbers, so I'm going to have 0, 2 pi over 4, 2 pi over 2, 6 pi over 4 and 2 pi over 1. Now, I've got to take each one of these and add it to my phase shift. Well, my phase shift here is 3 pi over 4. So I'm just going to add these all the way down, 3 pi over 4 to each one. So now, when I work this out, 0 plus 3 pi over 4 just gives me 3 pi over 4. I have a common denominator here, so 2 plus 3 gives me 5 pi divided by 4. I do not have common denominators here with 2 pi over 2 plus 3 pi over 4. So if I multiply 2 pi over 2 by 2, that gives me 4 pi over 4. And now I can add, because I have a common denominator, so I'm going to get 7 pi divided by 4. Next one, I have common denominators of 4, so 6 pi plus 3 pi gives me 9 pi divided by 4. Again, I do not have common denominators, so I'm going to need to multiply here by 4 and 4, giving me 8 pi over 4. Adding them together, 8 plus 2 gives me 9. Now, looking at this, I should have 3 pi over 4 here. So 8 pi plus 3 pi over 4 gives me 11 pi over 4. That gives me all 5 of my points, and I need to plot them on the graph. So where are those points going to be? Well, I have 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4, 9 pi over 4, and 11 pi divided by 4. So there's my 5 points. So I've graphed my points. I've done what's inside the parentheses. So I've taken care of what's inside this parentheses. Everything inside these parentheses gives me my points here. Now, I need to take care of my amplitude and my vertical shift. My vertical shift, so I was here at the x-axis, well, I've got to go down 1. My amplitude is up 1 and down 1, and I've got to graph the cosine function, so I'm going to start at my top, then my midline, then my bottom amplitude, then my midline, and then my top amplitude, making and connecting my points I have here. Now remember back to the last problem, if it helps, highlight or draw a shaded line at your top and bottom amplitude, and that may help you see a little bit better. Now, remember, each place that this function hits, the cosine function hits that green dotted midline, I'm going to have an asymptote. And then I take my points that are left over, my max and min points, and I make my parabolas. Now, I've got a lot of stuff highlighted, colored here, so I'm going to erase away my red line. I'm going to erase away my highlights a little bit. And I'm just going to write back in my points there. So here was 3 pi divided by 4, 5 pi divided by 4, 7 pi divided by 4, 9 pi divided by 4, and 11 pi divided by 4. And this will give me my final graph of the y equals secant, parentheses, theta minus 3 pi over 4, inner parentheses, minus 1.